History is often told like a grand parade of kings, emperors, and generals, where the spotlight shines on men who commanded armies, signed decrees, and built empires. But what if the most captivating parts of the story have been hidden just out of view? What if, behind the curtains of palaces, upon the waves of the open sea, or along the fragile frontiers of new worlds, there were voices shaping events in ways that history books rarely acknowledge? These voices belonged to women whose influence was profound, whose strategies were brilliant, and whose presence was essential to the survival and transformation of societies. Yet their names have been minimized, their legacies reshaped, and their power buried under centuries of selective storytelling. The stories of these forgotten figures are not just tales of survival. They are stories of resilience, daring, and influence that challenge our very idea of what power looks like. Imagine a woman who rose from a fisherman's widow to command the largest pirate fleet the world had ever seen, enforcing her own laws across the South China Sea. Think of a princess who wielded intelligence and diplomacy in the dangerous halls of a Tang dynasty court, where even her ambition was seen as a threat to imperial order. Picture a young Powhatan woman standing between her people and the foreign settlers of Jamestown, bridging cultures at a time when mistrust could easily have destroyed them both. These are not side notes or romanticized legends. They are true architects of history, whose choices and actions continue to echo through time. And yet, their influence has often been written out, remembered in fragments, or reshaped to suit someone else's narrative. They remind us that history is never neutral. It is constructed, framed, and retold depending on who is holding the pen. To rediscover their stories is to challenge that silence. It is to recognize that power does not only rest in thrones or armies, but also in negotiation, in strategy, and in survival. This video is an invitation to step into that hidden world, to look beyond the myths, beyond the familiar stories, and uncover the indelible mark of women who defied expectations and changed the course of history. Together, we will trace their journeys across empires and oceans, across dynasties and frontiers, to reveal a tapestry that is far richer and more complex than the history we thought we knew. And as we bring their voices back to life, we will ask a question that lingers long after the stories are told. How much of history truly remembers, and how much still remains to be uncovered? Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will explore the forgotten influence of women whose stories continue to shape our world, even if history tried to erase them. Opening the tapestry of history is often like unrolling a woven fabric, where certain threads are brightly lit, while others are muted, nearly hidden, or even cut off. The chronicles of empires have traditionally celebrated kings, generals, and male rulers who shaped armies and expanded borders, while the influence of women has often been left in shadow. Yet within those folds of forgotten stories are the quiet yet undeniable forces of queens, consorts, advisors, and leaders who shaped the course of nations without always holding a crown in their own right. Their power did not always rest on a throne or an official title. Sometimes it lay in the ability to influence, to counsel, to persuade, and to leave marks on culture, politics, and memory in ways that may not be fully credited by the chroniclers of their age. These women's voices are faint in the official records, but when pieced together from fragments of texts, inscriptions, and legacies, they form an echo that stretches across centuries. The forgotten influence of these women reminds us that history is rarely as straightforward as it appears. We are used to hearing of emperors commanding armies, kings declaring laws, and male rulers creating dynasties. Yet behind those declarations there were often women advising, guiding, and shaping decisions. The common story presented in classrooms and books may suggest that once a ruler died or a queen was widowed, her influence faded. But the truth is more complex. Even when direct authority slipped from their hands, the networks they built, the cultural shifts they encouraged, and the traditions they inspired endured. Their presence in history may have been downplayed, but their actions continued to ripple long after their lifetimes. What becomes striking is not only what they accomplished during their era, but how their influence resonated in unseen ways, through policy, religion, art, and even the psychology of rule. When one asks how much of history truly remembers, a deeper question arises. Are we content with the version we inherit, or do we dare to search for the missing figures who shaped the story but never received their due? This question compels us to consider the silences in the record. If so many women shaped empires but were left unnamed, how much else has been hidden or erased? How do we measure the invisible weight of their presence, which might not be captured in the lists of kings, but is still felt in the endurance of traditions and the turning points they influenced. Curiosity grows when we realize that empires, often thought of as male-dominated institutions, were not isolated from the guidance and ambition of women. Without these voices, the history we inherit is incomplete. Recognizing their place not only honors them, but gives us a fuller picture of how power truly moved across time. The ancient world offers striking examples of this hidden influence. Consider the courts of Egypt, where royal women were not always rulers in the sense of being pharaohs, though a handful held that position, but often acted as co-regents, priestesses, and keepers of divine order. While names like Cleopatra linger in memory because of dramatic encounters with Rome, countless others remain obscured. Queen mothers and high priestesses shaped the succession of rulers, secured alliances, and determined the religious landscape. In their roles, they could dictate temple funding, guide the building of monuments, and even influence the portrayal of kingship itself. Their impact did not disappear once their lives ended. The architecture they commissioned and the policies they supported shaped cultural continuity. The fact that their memory was sometimes deliberately erased shows how threatening their power could appear to later rulers who wished to rewrite history. A similar story can be seen in Mesopotamia, where inscriptions tell of women who governed provinces, commanded estates, and played essential roles in diplomacy. Royal daughters and wives were often married across kingdoms to secure peace or alliances, but these marriages were not mere tokens. The women themselves often carried the traditions, languages, and rituals of their homeland into new courts, merging cultures in ways that left lasting marks. Through them, knowledge spread, and dynasties expanded their reach. They became cultural bridges, their influence woven into songs, rituals, and law codes even if their names did not endure in the same way as their husbands or brothers. Their significance becomes clear when we trace the cultural blending that emerged in regions where they served as mediators. Moving forward to the classical world, the story continues in Greece and Rome, where women of the elite navigated societies that often restricted their public roles, yet could not entirely silence them. Roman empresses, for instance, wielded remarkable influence from behind palace walls. They guided succession disputes, controlled court factions, and even shaped foreign policy. The legacies of figures like Livia, wife of Augustus, demonstrate how careful counsel and political maneuvering could secure dynastic continuity. She did not stand in front of armies or give speeches in the Senate, but her hand was present in the stability and image of the imperial family. What survives in statues, inscriptions, and anecdotes about her suggests a deliberate effort to portray her as both maternal and divine, an image that shaped expectations of women in later dynasties. The fact that accusations and rumors surrounded her name also reflects the anxiety surrounding women who wielded influence in spaces traditionally seen as male. Across Asia, the legacies of powerful women are equally compelling. In China, imperial consorts, empresses, and dowagers often held the keys to stability during times of succession crisis. Some stepped into ruling roles directly, while others influenced from behind a curtain. Even when official histories attempted to downplay their power, records of court intrigues and edicts reveal the extent of their authority. The most famous example, Empress Wu, left a legacy that redefined what women could achieve in imperial China, though her reign was later vilified to fit a narrative of caution. Yet even less remembered empresses guided imperial decisions, shaped the education of heirs, and promoted cultural projects. Their patronage of literature, art, and religion left imprints on dynasties long after they were gone, making it clear that their impact cannot be measured solely by the years they lived or the titles they carried. In South Asia, queens and consorts navigated a world of kingdoms, trade routes, and religious developments. Some actively led troops, while others built temples or became patrons of learning. Their cultural contributions, visible in architecture, poetry, and philosophy, shaped the identity of entire regions. When widowed, many continued to exert influence through regency roles or spiritual authority. Their stories remind us that power does not always require holding a crown. Influence can manifest in shaping traditions, preserving dynasties, or even challenging norms in ways that future generations would adopt. The story stretches as well to Africa beyond Egypt, where women in kingdoms such as Kush, Ethiopia, and later regions of West Africa held authority both as rulers and as cultural leaders. Their ability to negotiate, lead armies, or sponsor religious practices shows how multifaceted their roles were. They were remembered in oral traditions, even when written sources diminished them, and in some cases their names are preserved in monuments, carvings, and songs that endured for centuries. Their presence demonstrates that across diverse continents, the influence of women was not an exception, but a recurring, though often obscured, reality of empire. When we consider medieval Europe, the picture becomes clearer still. Queens, duchesses, and noble women played decisive roles in diplomacy and governance. They arranged marriages that secured peace, managed estates that provided resources for armies, and at times acted as regents when kings were absent or children sat on the throne. Some engaged directly in political maneuvering, correspondence with popes, and participation in crusades. Their contributions were frequently framed as extensions of family duty rather than as personal ambition, but that framing itself reveals how chroniclers sought to minimize their agency. Yet the treaties signed, the cultural institutions they sponsored, and the heirs they educated testify to the breadth of their involvement. Their influence was often indirect, but its effects were long-lasting. The Islamic world provides further illustration, where women in courts of caliphs and sultans engaged in politics, scholarship, and patronage. Some became recognized for their intellectual contributions, while others shaped succession through strategic interventions. Poetry, architecture, and legal traditions carry marks of their sponsorship, and while chroniclers sometimes portrayed them as disruptive, this portrayal itself signals their importance. Their presence demonstrates that no empire was untouched by female influence, even in regions where societal expectations restricted women's public roles. Across the Atlantic, the story continues in the empires of the Americas. In Maya and Inca societies, royal women served not only as consorts but as ritual leaders, mediators of divine power, and symbols of continuity. Their influence on religious life and statecraft was profound. Archaeological evidence suggests that their images were placed in temples and carvings to legitimize dynasties. While later colonial narratives often overlooked them, the persistence of their presence in material culture and oral memory reveals that they shaped the very foundations of those civilizations. When we step back and survey this wide span of time and geography, a pattern emerges. Women in empires were not passive figures waiting to be remembered only for beauty or motherhood. They were active shapers of history whose influence was disguised under layers of male-centered storytelling. Their names may not be as widely known as the emperors and kings they stood beside, but their contributions were no less vital. Whether through diplomacy, regency, patronage, or even rebellion, they ensured the survival, adaptation, and growth of their societies. The question that lingers is not whether they mattered, but how much of their importance we are still missing by relying on incomplete records. The idea that their direct power may have faded while their impact endured invites us to reflect on how memory functions. Power is often measured by official titles, armies commanded, or laws enacted. Yet real influence can be more subtle, surviving in traditions, institutions, and cultural legacies. A queen who supported a religion helped ensure its survival for generations. A consort who negotiated peace between rival states shaped the course of wars that never came to pass. A regent who educated a young heir influenced policies decades into the future. These contributions may not appear on the surface of political chronicles, but their echoes are undeniable when one studies the long arc of history. This recognition also forces us to question the very structure of historical memory. Why do some figures endure in public consciousness while others fade? Often it is not a matter of significance, but of storytelling. Chroniclers, usually men tied to rulers, framed narratives to suit political agendas. Women who challenged norms or exercised influence outside accepted boundaries were often vilified, erased, or reduced to caricatures. Others were celebrated only as symbols of piety, fertility, or devotion, stripping away their political agency. The result is a tapestry with gaps, where certain figures shine brightly while others are hidden behind layers of silence. To uncover them requires not only examining written records, but also listening to oral traditions, studying art, and questioning what is absent as much as what is present. The hook that draws us deeper is the unresolved question. How much of history truly remembers these women, and how much has been forgotten? If so many names are missing, how different might our understanding of empire and power be if their stories were fully told? What would it mean to see history not as the march of kings and generals alone, but as a dialogue between visible rulers and those who worked in subtler but equally impactful ways? To ask these questions is not to diminish the achievements of men, but to recognize that history as we know it is incomplete without the contributions of women. Their silence in the record is not proof of absence, but evidence of selective memory. Curiosity about these hidden figures invites us to reimagine the past with greater accuracy and inclusivity. The stories of powerful women in empires are a reminder that influence does not always require recognition. Even when their names were erased, their choices left traces. They guided the tides of history through negotiation, creativity, and persistence. Their forgotten influence challenges us to look again at the tapestry of the past and to notice the threads that may have been hidden but remain strong, holding the fabric together. And as we ask how much history truly remembers, we may realize that rediscovering them is not only about honoring their lives, but also about understanding our shared human story with greater depth and truth. The stories of hidden power often show how women shaped kingdoms and courts, but there are also tales where they commanded entire seas, proving that influence was not confined to palaces or temples. Just as queens and consorts bent dynastic fates through diplomacy, there were women who seized command with direct action, rewriting expectations of leadership. Among the most striking figures to emerge in this light is Zheng Yi, a woman whose name does not often appear in common accounts of maritime history, yet whose power on the waves rivaled and even surpassed that of celebrated admirals and naval commanders. Her life carries forward the theme of forgotten influence, because her rise, her brilliance in strategy, and her enduring impact stand as a testimony to how far-reaching a woman's authority could become, even in domains thought impossible for her gender. She began not as a royal daughter or consort, but as a woman bound to the life of the fishing villages scattered along the southern coasts of China. Born into modest circumstances, her early years gave little hint of the role she would one day play in commanding thousands of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. She married Jing Yi, a prominent pirate leader who had built his fortune and reputation through control of sea routes and the constant contest between maritime clans. In those waters, piracy was not a scattered business of a few rogue ships, but an entire system of organization, with families, fleets, and rival confederations vying for dominance. It was into this world that Zheng Yi entered, first as the wife of a man who already carried weight, and then, after his death, as the architect of a dynasty on the seas. When her husband died, many would have expected her to fade into the background, perhaps retreating to widowhood or being pushed aside by ambitious male captains eager to seize control. Instead, she stepped forward with remarkable boldness. She claimed authority not only through her connection to her late husband, but through her sheer determination and talent. She forged alliances with key lieutenants, consolidated command over fragmented fleets, and turned what could have been a period of collapse into the foundation of unmatched power. In doing so, she broke expectations in a society and an age that rarely recognized women as military leaders. Yet she did not merely survive in a man's world. She redefined it, establishing herself as the undisputed leader of what became the largest pirate confederation in recorded history. Her control stretched across the South China Sea, where she commanded a force of ships so vast that imperial officials trembled at the mention of her name. She imposed order upon fleets that had once operated with rivalry and chaos, enforcing discipline with laws that were both strict and effective. Loot was to be divided fairly, desertion was punishable by death, and women captured during raids were to be protected rather than abused. These codes ensured loyalty and cohesion, making her organization far more formidable than loose bands of raiders. Her sailors followed her not only out of fear, but also because they respected her ability to provide structure and opportunity. In this way, she demonstrated an understanding of governance that went beyond the stereotype of pirates as reckless plunderers. She built a functioning system that rivaled the order of states themselves. Her genius extended beyond internal organization. Zheng Yi proved herself an extraordinary strategist, capable of matching imperial forces sent against her. The Qing dynasty, recognizing the threat she posed, launched naval expeditions to crush her power. Time after time, she outmaneuvered them, using superior knowledge of currents, winds, and terrain to her advantage. She coordinated fleets with precision, surrounding imperial ships, cutting off their supplies, and ensuring victories that stunned officials. At times she negotiated truces and manipulated rivalries between Qing authorities and European colonial powers, playing one side against another with remarkable skill. Her ability to combine military force with diplomacy allowed her to hold her position for years, long after most pirate leaders would have been captured or destroyed. The sheer scale of her command is difficult to imagine without falling into exaggeration. She oversaw not only fleets but an entire society afloat, with families, markets, and livelihoods tied to her leadership. She was more than a pirate queen. She became the sovereign of a maritime realm that functioned alongside the empire it defied. Fishermen, traders, and villagers across coastal regions knew her name, either as a terror or as a figure of protection, depending on their relationship with her organization. Her confederation imposed taxes on merchants, controlled ports, and demanded tribute in ways that mirrored the functions of an official government. In many ways, she stood as both a challenger and an alternative to imperial authority. Even in the face of mounting pressure, she displayed an ability to adapt. Realizing that the empire, aided by foreign powers, could eventually overwhelm her fleets, she negotiated her own path to survival. Rather than being captured in defeat, she secured terms of surrender that allowed her to retire with honor and wealth, an outcome almost unheard of for a pirate leader of her scale. She was not executed, nor was she forced into exile. Instead, she transitioned into a life where she maintained influence through business and family, proving once again that her power rested not only in force but in intelligence and foresight. In this, she distinguished herself from countless other figures whose lives ended violently. Her ability to exit at a time of her choosing underscores the depth of her strategic mind. The legacy of Zheng Yi extends far beyond the plunder of her years at sea. She reshaped the very notion of piracy in her era, demonstrating that it could be transformed into a disciplined and organized power capable of rivaling states. She also altered the balance of maritime trade. Merchants and imperial officials alike had to contend with her authority, adjusting their routes and strategies to avoid her fleets. The reach of her decisions extended not only across her own waters, but into the larger networks of commerce that linked Asia to the rest of the world. Her challenge to imperial control revealed vulnerabilities in the Qing naval system and forced changes that would affect maritime policy for years afterward. Her story also speaks to the resilience of women who defied the constraints of their societies. She was not remembered in official histories with the reverence given to emperors or generals, but her presence survives in folklore, records of negotiations, and the astonishment of those who faced her power. She carved out authority in a world that had no place prepared for her, and she left behind a legacy that demonstrates how deeply women could shape history even when written accounts sought to diminish them. Her life reminds us that power can be claimed in unexpected places, and that influence is not limited by birth or expectation. To understand Zheng Yi is to understand a broader truth about forgotten influence. Just as queens in courts and empresses behind curtains shaped dynasties through diplomacy and counsel, this woman of the seas shaped an empire through defiance and command. She stands at the intersection of two themes: the invisibility of women in traditional narratives and the undeniable force of their actions when we look closely enough. Her story calls us back to the central question: how much does history truly remember, and how much remains hidden? If a woman who commanded the largest pirate confederation in history can be reduced to a footnote in many accounts, what does that say about the countless others who never even made it into the margins? Her rise from the wife of a fisherman to the ruler of the seas is not simply a tale of adventure. It is a lesson about the construction of memory, about the way societies choose which stories to preserve and which to obscure. It is also a reminder of the universality of ambition, intelligence, and courage, qualities that know no gender. Zheng Yi's name may not be as widely known as those of kings or admirals, but her achievements surpass many of theirs. She remains an example of what it means to be the architect of a dynasty, not of land but of waves, and her life expands the tapestry of hidden power that stretches across history. By placing her story alongside those of queens and empresses, we see more clearly how women have shaped empires not only in palaces and temples, but on the very seas that carried trade, war, and culture from one corner of the world to another. The sea eventually yielded back its silence after Zheng Yi secured her place in history, not through defeat, but through a negotiated retirement that left her with wealth and dignity. Yet the theme of influence beyond expectation did not stop with her, or with the waves she once commanded. If her dominion was over the open waters, another woman's domain lay within the intricate chambers of a palace, where ambition was cloaked in etiquette, ritual, and whispers behind carved screens. To move from the South China Sea to the imperial court of Tang, China, is to shift the setting, but the essence of unseen power remains constant. Just as Zheng Yisao revealed what a woman could do with fleets and storms, Princess Taiping revealed what a woman could accomplish in the carefully woven networks of dynasty, bloodline, and intrigue. She was the daughter of Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to openly declare herself emperor in title as well as in practice. To be born into such a legacy meant both opportunity and danger. On one hand, Princess Taiping inherited proximity to absolute power, raised in a court where her mother defied centuries of patriarchal tradition. On the other hand, she carried the burden of expectation, suspicion, and the delicate balancing act of surviving in a family where succession could turn into rivalry overnight. While many daughters of emperors faded into ceremonial roles, Taiping grew into something more formidable. She learned the art of politics not from the outside, but from within the household of the most ambitious woman in Chinese imperial history. The chronicles suggest that she observed closely how her mother consolidated rule, watching how alliances were made with officials, how enemies were disarmed through appointments or executions, and how legitimacy could be shaped by ritual and ideology. This education was not delivered in classrooms, but lived daily in the palace, where every word carried meaning and every gesture signaled potential allegiance. From her earliest years, Taiping seemed to understand that the throne was not only a seat but a contested idea, and that to thrive in its shadow required a sharp mind, patience, and daring. She grew into this role with a natural confidence, building her own networks of supporters and cultivating influence that extended well beyond what most princesses were allowed. Her political acumen became visible in the way she navigated court decisions. When debates arose over succession, her voice was not merely decorative. She counseled her mother, provided assessments of rival claimants, and worked to ensure that outcomes favored her own position or at least her survival. At times she acted as mediator between factions, using her lineage as a bridge, while at other times she pursued her own agenda with striking boldness. Records indicate that she played a role in encouraging her mother to consider different heirs, shifting the balance of power in moments that might otherwise have tipped toward instability. She was not content to be a silent figure in rituals. She was active, engaged, and willing to make her presence felt. Her ambition extended beyond advice. Taiping cultivated her own faction of officials, eunuchs, and courtiers who relied on her favor. She used her wealth and position to reward loyalty, understanding that gifts and patronage could bind allies as effectively as decrees. She also possessed the ability to read situations with clarity. When rivals underestimated her, she turned their complacency into opportunity. When opponents recognized her sharpness, they feared the subtlety with which she could reshape conversations, often without raising her voice. This talent for maneuvering in a space dominated by men was remarkable, especially in an era when female power was often considered an anomaly even in the presence of her mother's reign. Succession struggles in the Tang dynasty were labyrinthine, filled with shifting alliances, betrayals, and fragile balances of authority. Taiping stood at the center of many of these storms. After her mother's rule, she continued to wield influence during the reigns of her brothers, pressing for policies, advising on appointments, and at times clashing with their authority. She was capable of mobilizing supporters in the court to block or advance proposals. She knew how to exploit divisions among officials, ensuring that her own interests remained safeguarded. This was not passive survival but active engagement, a deliberate shaping of politics by a woman who understood both her risks and her potential. Yet such power, even when carefully exercised, always drew suspicion. Taiping's closeness to the throne made her both indispensable and dangerous. Her brothers, especially Emperor Ruizong and later Emperor Xuanzong, recognized her influence and at times relied on her. But reliance could quickly transform into fear, for they knew her ambition was not content with a ceremonial role. She seemed always a step away from being perceived as a rival rather than an ally. This duality defined much of her later life. Trusted advisor on one hand, potential usurper on the other. Her fall came not through a lack of intelligence, but through the inevitability of court politics, where trust was fragile and ambition could easily be recast as treason. When Xuanzong solidified his authority, he perceived her influence as a threat that could destabilize his reign. Despite her previous loyalty, he acted decisively, stripping her of power and eventually forcing her into a fate that ended with her death under circumstances that suggest compulsion rather than choice. In the end, she could not escape the cycle of suspicion that often devoured even the most careful players of palace intrigue. Yet her legacy did not vanish with her life. Whispered accounts of her brilliance continued to circulate in later generations. Some saw her as a cautionary tale of ambition that reached too far, a reminder to future rulers of the dangers of allowing women too much sway in politics. Others saw her as an example of what could be achieved by a woman who refused to accept silence as her role. Her story lived on not only in official histories, where her name appeared alongside accusations, but in the quieter reflections of those who recognized her strategic mind. In the cultural memory of China, she became both a symbol of potential and a warning, embodying the contradictions that come when women step into spaces claimed by men. Her life resonates with the same themes that define Zheng Yi, though the settings could not be more different. Where one commanded waves and ships, the other navigated ritual and protocol. Where one faced storms of nature and fleets of enemies, the other confronted suspicion and betrayal in gilded halls. Yet both revealed the depth of female agency in times and places that often refused to acknowledge it openly. Both demonstrated that power could be seized, shaped, and maintained even when every tradition argued against it. And both left legacies that unsettled the certainty of male-dominated narratives. Princess Taiping's life also underscores the complexity of remembering women in history. She was not cast in the same mold as her mother, who dared to sit on the throne itself, but she was not a passive daughter either. She existed in the shadows, sometimes aiding, sometimes challenging, always calculating. That she did not become empress in her own right does not diminish her importance. Rather, it reveals how power could be exercised without titles, how influence could persist in spaces unseen, and how history's obsession with crowns and thrones overlooks the subtler realities of authority. Her tragic end cannot erase the years when her judgment shaped policies, guided rulers, and influenced the direction of the dynasty. If Zheng Yi's negotiated retirement stands as a rare victory for a pirate leader, Princess Taiping's forced death reminds us of the dangers women faced when their brilliance threatened established hierarchies. Both outcomes, though opposite in tone, point to the reality that female power was never simple, always contested, and forever vulnerable to being rewritten or erased. Yet both also testify that such power existed, and that it mattered deeply. When we return to the central question of how much history remembers, Princess Taiping's story offers a poignant answer. The official chronicles remembered her ambition, but often framed it as dangerous excess. They remembered her influence, but described it as manipulation rather than governance. They remembered her fall, but often ignored her years of success. What they did not fully preserve was the insight that she was among the most capable political minds of her time, a woman who mastered the language of power as well as any man of her era. To recover that truth requires looking beyond the surface, beyond the accusations, and into the patterns of decision and alliance that defined her role. The whispers that survived ensured that she was never entirely forgotten. For some, she remained a figure of fear, a reminder that unchecked ambition could threaten dynasties. For others, she remained a figure of admiration, a rare daughter who matched the sharpness of her mother and carried forward the spirit of resistance against silence. Either way, she left a mark that future generations could not ignore. Her life, like that of so many other women in empires across history, reveals the strength of influence even when it does not culminate in an official title. To weave her into the broader tapestry of hidden power is to see more clearly how diverse and multifaceted women's roles in history truly were. Princess Taiping did not sit upon the throne, but she stood close enough to feel its heat, and she played the game of politics with a mastery that rivaled any emperor. Her story, joined with those of figures like Zheng Yi and countless queens, empresses, and consorts, builds a richer understanding of how power moved through history. It reminds us that the narrative of human civilization is incomplete without them, and that the threads they spun continue to shape the fabric of memory even when official accounts tried to cut them away. Princess Taiping's life, with all its triumphs and its tragic conclusion, challenges us to reconsider what it means to be powerful. Was it the crown that defined authority, or the ability to shape outcomes behind the scenes? Was it the armies one commanded, or the alliances one built through words and influence? Her example suggests that the measure of power is not always in the symbols that survive, but in the effects that endure. And by this measure, she remains an empress in all but title, a sovereign of strategy whose shadow still lingers in the story of one of history's greatest dynasties. Princess Taiping's life stands as a striking reminder of how women could shape dynasties from within the shadows of imperial palaces. Her influence was strategic, her alliances deliberate, and her downfall tragic, yet the whispers of her brilliance continued to ripple through time. When placed beside the legacy of Zheng Yisaw's command of the seas, or the subtler power of queens and empresses across continents, we begin to see a larger truth. Women, even when unnamed in chronicles or remembered through distorted lenses, were architects of history in their own right. Their presence was not confined to one empire, one age, or one cultural sphere. Their influence stretched from gilded courts to stormy waters, and even into the contested frontiers of new worlds where empires collided and reshaped one another. It is in this transition that another story emerges, one that has often been framed in myth and romance, but deserves to be understood with the seriousness it commands. That is the story of Pocahontas, a young woman who became an unlikely diplomat between her people and a new colonial presence, and whose short life had lasting consequences that reached far beyond what she herself might have imagined. Pocahontas is one of the most recognized figures from early American history, but recognition does not always equal understanding. Over time, her image has been shaped by folklore, fiction, and legend, often reduced to the tale of a young native woman saving an Englishman from execution. While that single narrative has been repeated for centuries, it overshadows her actual role as a mediator, negotiator, and symbol of fragile peace during one of the most transformative and violent moments in the history of the land. To reframe her story is to strip away layers of myth and look at the lived reality of a woman whose choices and actions bridged two cultures in conflict, even if only for a fleeting moment. Born into the Powhatan Confederacy, she was the daughter of Wahunsenkaw, the paramount chief who led a vast network of tribes along the rivers and woodlands of what would become Virginia. From her earliest years, she was positioned at the heart of political life, not as a ruler in waiting, but as part of a lineage that symbolized unity and authority. Her childhood name carried meanings tied to playfulness and liveliness, but as she grew, she inherited responsibilities beyond the carefree image later imposed upon her. She was raised in a society where kinship, ritual, and diplomacy were intertwined, and where the arrival of English settlers at Jamestown disrupted a delicate balance of land, resources, and sovereignty. Into this clash she would step, not as a passive figure, but as an active participant. The encounter between her people and the English was not simply a meeting of strangers, but the beginning of a struggle for dominance, survival, and identity. For the Powhatan Confederacy, the settlers represented both an opportunity and a threat. Potential partners in trade, but also intruders with insatiable demands. For the settlers, the indigenous people were both essential for survival and obstacles to expansion. In this tense environment, Pocahontas became a figure whose actions could tilt the fragile balance. Accounts suggest that her intervention in saving John Smith from execution, while often dramatized, represented more than an act of compassion. It was also a symbolic gesture of diplomacy, a way of signaling the possibility of alliance, and perhaps a ritualized act intended to incorporate Smith into the network of relationships under her father's authority. Whether she fully grasped the political weight of her role at that moment is uncertain, but the event set the stage for her enduring image as a bridge between two worlds. Her involvement in brokering peace extended beyond that episode. She visited Jamestown, carrying food and provisions during periods of famine, ensuring the survival of settlers who might otherwise have perished. These visits were not casual. They were deliberate actions that shaped the relationship between her people and the colonists. By bringing supplies, she not only alleviated hunger, but also established herself as a trusted intermediary. Her presence signaled to the English that diplomacy was possible, while signaling to her people that she carried influence in these fragile exchanges. This role placed her at the center of one of the earliest moments of coexistence between indigenous nations and European settlers, even if that coexistence was always uneasy. When conflicts escalated, her position became even more complex. She was captured by the English during a campaign intended to pressure her father into concessions. Rather than being a simple hostage, she became part of negotiations, a living guarantee of dialogue. During her captivity, she was introduced to Christianity and eventually baptized under the name Rebecca. Whether this conversion was an act of personal conviction, a survival strategy, or a symbolic concession to her captors, it cemented her role as a cultural bridge. She later married John Rolfe, an English tobacco planter, a union that was framed as both a personal bond and a diplomatic tool. Through this marriage, a temporary peace was secured between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English settlers, a peace that allowed for trade, expansion, and the fragile illusion of harmony. Her marriage to Rolfe carried significance far beyond personal life. It represented one of the earliest moments when intermarriage was used as a means of binding two cultures in the North American context. The so-called peace it brought became known as the period of relative calm in Virginia, a breathing space that allowed the struggling colony to gain a firmer foothold. Her role in that moment was not incidental but central. Without her presence, the political landscape might have taken a far bloodier turn even sooner than it eventually did. She embodied the possibility of coexistence, even if that possibility was temporary and fraught with inequality. Pocahontas's journey did not end in Virginia. She traveled to England with her husband and child, where she was presented at court as a symbol of the potential for civilizing and converting native peoples. In London, she became both a curiosity and a propaganda figure, used to demonstrate the supposed success of colonial efforts. Yet beneath the spectacle was the reality of a young woman far from home, navigating a world entirely different from the one she had known. Her presence in England made her one of the first indigenous people to cross the Atlantic and stand in the very heart of the empire that would one day dominate her homeland. Her dignity and composure in that foreign environment testified to her resilience and adaptability. Tragically, her life was cut short when she fell ill and died at a young age before she could return to her homeland. Her death silenced a voice that had, in its brief span, carried immense symbolic weight. Yet her influence did not end with her passing. The marriage she entered, the peace she brokered, and the image she left behind shaped not only the future of Virginia, but also the broader narrative of America's beginnings. Her story became part of the myth of origins, retold in countless ways, often stripped of nuance, but never forgotten. Her legacy as a bridge builder remains both inspiring and contested. On one hand, she represents the potential for diplomacy, understanding, and human connection even in times of conflict. On the other, her story highlights the tragic costs of colonization, where indigenous lives were often manipulated, reshaped, or sacrificed to serve the narratives of conquerors. She was remembered as a romantic heroine, but behind the romance was the reality of a woman whose actions held empires at bay, if only for a moment. The peace she helped secure did not last. Yet without it, the course of colonial expansion might have unfolded with even greater violence from the very beginning. Her enduring journey forces us to question the nature of history itself. Was she a willing diplomat, a pawn of forces larger than herself, or something in between? Did she choose her path, or was it chosen for her by circumstance, power, and survival? These questions do not diminish her role, but rather reveal the complexity of her position. She was not a passive symbol, but a person whose decisions, however constrained, altered the trajectory of relations between two worlds. Her story reminds us that women often became the intermediaries through which empires negotiated, resisted, or adapted. Placed alongside Princess Taiping, Pocahontas reflects a pattern of women shaping history through influence rather than official authority. One navigated court politics at the center of a dynasty, the other stood at the threshold of a new world where cultures collided. Both reveal that the shaping of history is not confined to the acts of emperors, generals, or settlers. It also rests in the choices of women who found themselves in extraordinary positions, who carried responsibilities heavier than most could bear, and whose lives left echoes far greater than the years they lived. Pocahontas's life continues to inspire reflection because it straddles two narratives: the indigenous struggle to retain sovereignty and the colonial drive to expand. She is remembered in monuments, literature, and film, but beyond the images lies the truth of her influence. She helped shape early American history not by conquest or decree, but by embodying the fragile hope of coexistence. That hope may have been fleeting, but it set a precedent, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of cultural collision, individuals could act as bridges rather than barriers. Her enduring journey thus completes another strand in the tapestry of forgotten influence. From the courts of Tang, China to the seas of the South China coast, from the river valleys of Virginia to the halls of England, women have carried the burden of shaping history without always being remembered for it. They have been erased, mythologized, or misunderstood, yet their actions remain inscribed in the course of human events. Pocahontas stands among them, a figure whose life continues to challenge us to look deeper, to ask harder questions, and to honor the full complexity of her role. And so the question persists, the same one that threads through the stories of Taiping, Zheng Yi saw, and countless others. How much of history truly remembers, and how much remains hidden beneath the myths, distortions, and silences? In answering, we find that remembering Pocahontas not as a simple heroine, but as a diplomat, a negotiator, and a woman caught between worlds, allows us to see her more clearly. It allows us to see history itself more clearly. Her influence, like theirs, proves that even when the world sought to deny them, women shaped empires, dynasties, and the destinies of nations. Pocahontas's journey closes on a note that is both inspiring and tragic. Her story reminds us that influence can take many forms, that power is not always measured in crowns or armies, and that the presence of women in history is often visible only when we are willing to look past the myths that obscure them. She, like Princess Taiping, like Zheng Yi saw, like the many queens, empresses, and consorts who shaped their dynasties, reminds us of a truth often left unsaid. Women's voices, even when silenced in the official records, reverberated in the choices, the survival, and the transformation of entire societies. And from this point, as we reflect on their lives together, the echoes of their influence grow louder, weaving themselves into a pattern that continues to matter in our present time. The recurring pattern of forgotten power emerges when we hold these stories side by side. Each woman existed in an environment that was deeply structured against her. In imperial courts, in naval hierarchies, in confederacies disrupted by colonization, they were surrounded by systems that insisted authority belonged to men. Yet time and again, they found ways to bend those systems, to exploit the spaces between them, or to create new spaces entirely. Zheng Yi turned the chaos of piracy into an organized confederation that rivaled states. Princess Taiping transformed her mother's daring example into a subtler, sharper form of palace politics, maneuvering among factions that sought to silence her. Pocahontas stood between two cultures at war, choosing to act in ways that kept fragile peace alive, if only temporarily. Their lives may have unfolded in vastly different settings, but the pattern is unmistakable. Each found power in places where none was supposed to exist. Yet their legacies were deliberately obscured or reshaped. The reasons for this erasure are themselves revealing. In Zheng Yi's case, her unprecedented authority over the seas threatened the narrative of imperial control. To preserve the dignity of the Qing dynasty, official records sought to minimize her role, portraying her less as a commander and more as a curiosity. For Princess Taiping, the memory of her brilliance was rewritten into the language of excess ambition, cautioning later generations about the dangers of women who reached too far. For Pocahontas, her story was wrapped in romance, turned into a tale of saving an Englishman rather than a tale of shaping peace. In each case, memory was not neutral. It was political. Those who wrote history chose how to frame these women, and in doing so, they ensured that their power would be remembered only in distorted form. This recurring silencing tells us something about the nature of history itself. It is not only a collection of events, but also a selection of voices. Those who hold the pen decide what becomes legacy and what becomes silence. When women's roles threatened dominant narratives, their stories were reshaped, their agency reduced, their brilliance dimmed. Yet the traces remain. We find them in inscriptions, in rumors, in whispered accounts, in the survival of traditions that they themselves protected. To seek these traces is to recognize that the absence of recognition is not the absence of contribution. It is instead a sign of how threatening true recognition would have been to those who benefited from their erasure. The question then becomes, why do these stories matter now? Why do the forgotten voices of empires, seas, and colonies continue to resonate in a world so different from theirs? The answer lies in the struggles we still face over leadership, recognition, and representation. When we look at Zheng Yi, we see a model of leadership that was disciplined, pragmatic, and adaptive, qualities still prized today, but often coded as masculine. When we look at Princess Taiping, we see a woman who mastered political intelligence in an environment where her very presence was deemed dangerous, mirroring the challenges women continue to face in leadership positions where ambition in men is celebrated, but ambition in women is criticized. When we look at Pocahontas, we see the complexities of negotiation, compromise, and diplomacy in moments of cultural collision, a lesson still vital in today's world of global interaction and conflict. Their struggles mirror our own, their triumphs reflect possibilities still open, and their failures remind us of the costs of silencing certain voices. Contemporary discussions about female leadership often circle back to questions of representation. Who gets to lead, who gets remembered, and who is allowed to fail without their gender being used against them. These are not new debates. They are echoes of the same struggles these women faced centuries ago. Their lives show us that the problem has never been the absence of female leadership. It has always been the refusal to acknowledge it. Leadership was there in the commands of Zheng Yishua's fleets, in the strategies of Princess Taiping's alliances, in the diplomacy of Pocahontas's negotiations. The only absence was in the recognition given to them by those who shaped the historical record. By recovering their stories, we are not adding women into history where they did not exist. We are correcting distortions that removed them. The resonance of their stories today also lies in the way they challenge us to rethink the meaning of power. Too often, power is imagined as domination, as control imposed by force. But the lives of these women suggest a broader definition. Power can be found in building networks, in preserving peace, in sustaining traditions, in adapting to hostile circumstances. Power can be subtle, relational, and enduring. Zheng Yishua's laws for her confederation, Taiping's guidance over imperial decisions, Pocahontas's decision to carry food to starving settlers. These acts may not resemble the grand proclamations of emperors or generals, but they reshaped history just as decisively. In recognizing these acts, we expand our understanding of what leadership looks like. The enduring power of these narratives is not only in the past, but in the present call they issue to us. They remind us that our view of history is incomplete, that there are voices still missing, waiting to be uncovered. Every generation must ask who has been left out of the record, and every generation has the opportunity to bring those voices back. This is not only an act of justice for the past, but also a necessity for the present. By recognizing the breadth of those who shaped history, we allow ourselves to see more clearly the breadth of those who can shape the future. These stories also remind us of the cost of forgetting. When women's influence is erased, societies lose part of their memory. We lose examples of leadership that could inspire, lessons of diplomacy that could guide, and warnings of ambition suppressed that could caution. To allow these voices to remain silent is to accept a distorted view of humanity, one in which half the population is absent from the narrative of progress and struggle. But when we bring them back, the tapestry becomes richer, more complex, and more true. The call to action is therefore clear. To honor Zheng Yishua, Princess Taiping, Pocahontas, and countless others like them is not to romanticize their lives, but to understand them in their fullness. It is to see their intelligence, their bravery, their compromises, and their flaws. It is to resist the easy myths that reduce them to archetypes and instead to embrace their complexity. And it is to continue seeking out the stories of women who remain hidden in archives, in oral traditions, in ruins, in songs, and in memory. Their stories are not merely women's stories. They are human stories, central to the shaping of our world. The indelible mark they left can still be felt today. Zheng Yishua's organized piracy reshaped maritime policy in Asia. Princess Taiping's political maneuvering influenced the course of the Tang dynasty. Pocahontas's diplomacy altered the earliest years of American colonization. Each of these impacts extends beyond their lifetimes, proving that influence does not vanish when memory falters. Their lives remind us that while history can forget, the world still carries the marks of their choices. To trace those marks is to acknowledge the full scope of human influence, not only the parts deemed worthy of official memory. As we stand in the present, their echoes encourage us to imagine a future where leadership is not constrained by silence or erasure. They remind us that the stories we tell shape the possibilities we see. If we continue to tell history as though women were absent, we risk repeating the same patterns of exclusion. But if we tell history as it truly was, with all its voices included, we create a foundation for a future where no voice is considered disposable. The forgotten influence of the past can thus become the guiding influence of the future. Their narratives endure not because they were remembered perfectly, but because they cannot be fully erased. Even in distortion, their presence lingers. Even in silence, their choices echo. It is up to us to listen, to seek, and to honor them. And in doing so, we not only recover the truth of the past, but also strengthen the possibilities of our present and our future. The tapestry of history is never finished. New threads can be rediscovered, rewoven, and given their rightful place. Zheng Yishua's command of the seas, Princess Taiping's mastery of court politics, Pocahontas's role as a diplomat, All of these are threads that make the fabric stronger, more beautiful, more complete. Their stories call to us not only as memories, but as responsibilities. To carry them forward is to ensure that the world they shaped is not told, as though they were never there. And so the echoes continue, not faint but strong, not forgotten but waiting. Their mark is indelible. It is carved into the seas, into palaces, into the soil of Virginia, into the very rhythms of history. To hear them is to realize that hidden power was never truly hidden at all. It was always there, shaping, guiding, enduring. What remains is whether we are willing to listen, to remember, and to allow their influence to inspire the future we build.